Good evening, everyone. So good to be here with you in this beautiful room, and welcome to Start, Robert Stadler and Richard Artschwager. This is an exhibition that's been a little while in the making. We're really pleased to have you here and have you all here to talk about it with us. Together with Robert and myself, we have two additional voices joining the conversation. First on my extreme left, your right, Bob Monk, who I like to call the Richard Artschwager whisperer. Bob is at Gagosian and has been working with many artists as a curator for decades there, and first got to know Artschwager in the 1970s and worked very closely with him. So he's going to tell us some great stories about that experience and give us a kind of insider account of what it was like to work with Artschwager. And we also have Zoe Ryan, who I met as the design curator at the Art Institute of Chicago, but has recently become the director of the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art, that is, in Philadelphia. And we thought it would be a kind of perfect opportunity to hear from Zoe in this moment of design art transition, which is exactly what the exhibition is about in many ways. And of course, Robert Stadler needs no introduction as the artist who has initiated all of this and whose work forms the centerpiece along with Artschwager's downstairs. And Robert, I thought we might start with you, if that's okay. This idea came about because I had seen the exhibition you did at the Noguchi Museum here in New York, which paired Robert's work with Osamu Noguchi's. And we were talking about how fantastic it would be to pair Robert's work with another artist. Who might that be? And of course, Artschwager came to the forefront of our minds. And I think it might just be a good way to start, Robert, by asking you why Artschwager and what you see in him and how you see your own work corresponding with his.
That's like everything.
Yeah.
Well, first I have to say that I was very happy about that idea, of course, because Artschwager is like a long-term reference for me. When we discussed a lot of those parallels that I have to say I wasn't really aware of became clearer to me. Which one to start with is not easy, but let's say in general I was always interested in artists that in a way take you to a trip. Like what I mean with that is artists that you encounter a work. Of course you need an entry to the work, you need an attraction, but then it leads you somewhere else, or maybe even it misleads you on what was your first expectation, and it just gets richer and richer. And Richard Artschwager is actually definitely one of those. Yeah. So as Noguchi, who was also very, let's say, multifaceted artist and designer.
Yeah, it's interesting because Noguchi actually was a designer in a literal sense. So, you know, the famous Radio Nurse and the incredible playscapes that he made and other things that we would have to classify as design, whereas Artschwager is not really that. So he's not designing, you know, tables for mass production, but he seems to be involved with design in a real way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Bob can tell us much more about that, but he was a trained carpenter, so he came from design in a way, or he came from furniture making, he came from the everyday in a way, and then like he turned away from it, not losing the focus on the everyday, but turning these things into what he would call three-dimensional still lifes, and therefore, in that way, question the identity of those objects that surround us.
Yeah. So before we hear from Bob about the Artschwager view of that, Zoe, can I ask you to just briefly sort of set the stage for the conversation and talk about this relationship between an artist inhabiting the domain of design and a designer who, at least in my opinion, operates as a conceptual artist might, but in relation to design content. And I realize you've only seen the show for the first time tonight, coming up from Philadelphia, so this is like the quick take. But can you talk a little bit about your view as an experienced design curator who is now working in a contemporary art institution of how these different disciplines sit? Like, how do they relate to you? Do you actually see a difference between them anymore? How do you organize that for yourself?
My goodness, big questions. Thank you, Glenn. No, it's a pleasure to be here and to be back with Robert and to meet you. And thanks, Glenn, for inviting me. It's not that I'm going to deflect, but as you know, I take quite a liberal approach to what is art, architecture, design, and all of the above. I am not interested in necessarily the functionality. As a curator, I don't have to be. You know, it's not. But I'm interested in things that work, but I'm really interested in the questions. Like, what are the questions that are being posed to us through a piece of furniture or through a work of art? And it's really interesting that you, I think, asked me to be a part of the panel, because I've been at the ICA for 2 years now, and whenever someone brings an artist from about that period, the 60s and 70s, I have to do my homework, and typically my homework is Googling the ICA's own website to figure out, and I knew that Artschwager had shows, but he had his first, as ICA is so good, he had his first survey exhibition at ICA in 1979, but he was in a show in 1977, which is probably my favorite show of the ICA. He probably was in 10 to 15 shows at ICA. Big love, as you will talk about, from curators, lots of curators and directors at ICA. I think it goes to this crossover between him as someone obviously straddling the design world, then moving more into the art world. But there was an exhibition in '77 called Improbable Furniture, and it looked at artists whose subject and material was working with objects. So it could be Marcel Duchamp, it could be Max Ernst, it could be Yo-Yo Kusama, Richard Artschwager. They were all in this show. And there's a brilliant quote, and I had to write it down to make sure that I get it right. But I think for me, I really hold this true. And Suzanne Delahanty, I don't know if you know her, curated the show, Improbable Furniture. And the first line of the catalogue is, and this is a quote, "Furniture inhabits both the world we choose to call real and the world of our imagination." So I am, in my, when I'm obviously with my, and when I say I'm not interested in function, of course, there is irony in that, because of course when we're looking at furniture, there is, we're thinking about, is it going to be comfortable? Can you sit on it? But of course, the biggest criticism of doing a design show is, I can't sit on the furniture, so how do I know that that's a great piece of work? Whereas here, Robert, I think you've done something quite brilliant in that you're shifting our perspectives constantly. Your work sort of sits between Artschwager's and asks us to kind of reassess not only what's furniture or what's art, but like what is real and what is not. And I think for me, it's those questions that are more important than maybe the categories.
Yeah. I love the idea of improbableness, which is definitely a word you can throw at a lot of objects downstairs and it would stick to them. And I think, one of the experiences I've had in the show, just anecdotally, with people who don't know Artschwager's work that well, is that they actually don't know which things are by Artschwager and which ones are by Stadler. And there's this kind of like pop quiz quality to the show, which neither of us anticipated, being so familiar with Artschwager's work. And I think that speaks to the level of conversation between the two bodies of work. So we'll get more specific on that by talking about particular objects in a minute, including the 3D PD works, which you're seeing on the screen now as it happens, which are these incredible engineered stone works that Robert's made. But before we kind of dive into the show more deeply, Bob, can you just say, I don't even know what question to begin with, because we could talk for hours about him, but could you say a little bit about Artschwager's attitude to everyday objects, this idea of the work as a kind of still life that's in your space, and what you perceived him to be thinking about these design typologies that he occupied so brilliantly?
Well, with Artschwager, it actually starts, he actually did have a furniture company that many people don't know of. It was called Workbench in the 60s and early 70s. And so he did hone the woodworking skills that he later then used, with the Formica works. Artschwager had a funny beginning because his father sort of forced him to go to Cornell University to become a scientist and mathematician, as his father was from Cornell. And because Richard was bilingual, after the Second World War, which he fought in, he was in the Battle of the Bulge and other battles, he remained in Europe, and they sent him behind the lines to interrogate Nazis. So he came back a little later than most GIs, and he married a woman, an Austrian woman, while he was over there, and they have a daughter who's now probably, Eva's probably about 65 years old now. But anyway, I bring this up because when he came back, he kept complaining to his wife that he didn't want to be a mathematician or a scientist. He really wanted to be an artist. And her retort was, well, if you want to be an artist, be an artist. And so he then began to take the skills that he had acquired working in his wood shop all those years, and he then began to make, as we know, all these really quirky, really interesting objects. And it's really funny. I mean, it's always bad to become nostalgic for another age, but you have to imagine that when these things were first shown, they were absolutely surprising to the audience, whether it was other artists, galleries, museums. And from the beginning, as you say, his whole idea was sort of a composition in space. As a matter of fact, later on in his career, he began to also make those blips because he then began to realize that people were just looking like straight ahead or there, and he began to place things in really odd configurations. As a matter of fact,
sorry to interrupt, but can you just explain what the blips are for those who don't know? Because
blips are sort of, they're shapes, they're these black shapes that are almost expanded discs. So they have, the two sides are parallel and then the top and the bottom are sort of round. And he became very well known for those in the very famous exhibition, Live in Your Head, that Harold Zeeman did. And there are films about the installation, all the other artists, and how they were all, really helpful to each other in getting the show up on the walls. But his whole thing was like he would spray paint these blips on radiators, on the ceiling. And again, his whole idea was that all space, including everything you looked at, the floor, the ceiling, and then all the utilitarian objects that we live with every day were all fodder for what he wanted to do. And over the years, he really developed so many different groups of work that almost focused just on like one or two things. As a matter of fact, there was a review, there's a show of his work now in Basel, and I read a review this morning. They translated this review from German to English, and one of these I thought was funny was this really very large yellow exclamation point. They compared it to a bottle brush, but in a positive way. At first I was like, a bottle brush, and then talked about how everything in the exhibition was kind of domestic. But he always had that everything had a slight, twist to it. And I think one of the reasons was because, in my opinion, he really was a polymath. He was a very brilliant man. He spoke many languages. He was a great pianist, and he read a lot. And he was up on art from, classical Egyptian all the way up. And so he just had so many interests. He never stopped. He was always working. He didn't really care about things like money. He was married 4 times, and every time he divorced, he would very nicely say to the woman he was married to, "Oh, just take everything. I don't care." And he really did. He would just give away everything, and then he would find a new place to live and a new studio, and he would make new work. He was really someone who lived in his head. That's why I think it was great that he was in that show, Live in Your Head. But up until the time he was around 90 when he passed away, all of those beautiful cuts on the Formica and all the incredible detailing was all done by him. He was really a master, builder.
Yeah, and you get an incredible sense of the quality and intensity of the objects downstairs. I think, both Robert's work and Artschwager's work have that quality. Can I come back to you, Robert, and can you say a little bit, there's too much work in the show for us to talk about each in detail, but I absolutely want to give a few moments to the 3D PD works, of which there are several. There's another one over here in the corner for those of you who can see it, and it's made of this extraordinary material called Strato Olimpico marble, which is naturally striped. And the way that I think of it is that surface, which we might see normally on a countertop or maybe an architectural veneer, is like a kind of signal. And by giving us this stone in a volumetric way, as I say, kind of engineered into a mass, it's almost as if that signal breaks down. It's like the transmission is going out of focus, and you're hearing this kind of or like a white noise is exposed on the other faces. So that's kind of how I think of it, which of course relates very closely to Artschwager's use of Formica and the sort of articulation of a surface. But I'm sure people would be fascinated to know a little bit more about the behind-the-scenes story of that work, how it came about, how it in fact is made, the story of the stone, and so forth. Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, you said a lot of what I thought about this piece. But maybe just one word back to the blips, because what I think is interesting also and relates to what Zoe just said about the unimportance of categorization in a way, for you at least, but for me as well. And I think it's also even strange that we still talk about this today. Right? But what is so amazing about the blips is that they are totally beyond category, because you can say this is a painting, even if it's spray painted. You can say it's a sculpture, even if it sometimes has a physicality. It just sits. It informs the space like a parasite in a way. And I was always like, I always loved those pieces because they don't have one form. So it's not about the right form or the beautiful form. They can be more stretched, or they can be. Sometimes the shape is a perfect half circle. Sometimes it's just a curve. So it's they're
different materials as well.
In a way, super open.
Well, you know, he had one of them will reappear at the what's that area where the Chelsea Piers anyway.
The Highline.
The what?
No, you mean the Highline where there's one.
There's one that's going to reappear on a smokestack, but for 50 years on the east side there was a power plant, a Con Ed plant, and he had somebody go near the top, and so for 50 years there was a blip on the smokestack on the east side. That's now been raised, but now there'll be another one over here on the west side.
Yeah.
They're everywhere.
But say a little bit about 3D PD, yeah.
Yeah, those pieces, they are, so you said also technically. So technically they are made with technology or technique from today, which is also something that we kind of found out in doing this exhibition, is that some of the links that might be between the works is also, there's also the technical evolution.
Yeah.
Like, so PD stands for pietra dura, which has been, of course, is this ancient technique of marble inlay, which has, of course, been done by hand, whereas these pieces are water jet cut. And, well, the idea, how I came along, I just happened to see a block of this striato, actually, at one point, where I saw this, as you said, this fuzzy side, or the wrong side, actually, of the marble, because this marble is usually used for its perfect parallel lines, which is already something, I think, super interesting, because it looks like an artificial material. If you don't know if it's marble, you think it's like a robotic arm that sprayed those lines onto a synthetic material, but actually it's natural. And then, then there was this other side. So I thought it was interesting to not use this material for once as slabs, as we usually see it in architecture, or as you said, bathrooms, or even facades of buildings, but in a three-dimensional way, carving the piece out of a block. So the piece is somehow already in the block, and then we carve it out, placing it as we want in the block in order to obtain this transition of this white noise-ish surface to the straight lines.
Yeah. Okay. Zoe, do you want to say anything about that particular body of work, or how the show kind of strikes you? I mean, what were you noticing downstairs?
Yeah, I guess Glenn, when you first brought up that Robert's work was going to be in conversation with Artschwager's, I have to admit, I was like, racking my brain to think about that. But then when you, of course, I know Robert's work, and I immediately thought of, oh, yeah, they're both really interested in archetypes and very quotidian objects, and like playing with that. Because although, for me, what's interesting about Artschwager's background, of course, he pulls that through into his art practice, but he's still interested in the quotidian. He's still interested in chairs and tables and very banal, mundane stuff. But he's not interested in us. And I wonder, Robert, maybe it's a question for you. He doesn't create pictures or objects, I don't think so much to be seen, as so much to prompt us to figure out what we're looking at and the space around it. And sometimes I think when you're playing with archetypes of, I don't know, like the bistro chair or, some of your other work, it's also to really get us to think critically about the stuff that we just use every day, but then of course in turn our relationships to space, our relationships to one another. And for me, I think those are the types of things I'm interested in when I say, like, what are the questions, what are the provocations that an artist or a designer is asking us to think about. For me, it always comes down to the relationships between yourself and that object, and then what is that framing? And I think the work downstairs is really all about framing, isn't it? Framing the space or framing your own relationship to it, and also they're all quite unsettling in a way, aren't they? They're not. I mean, I don't know if you mean that, but for me, they're quite unsettling because there is a tension between like the surface and the volume and the pictorial and the sculptural and what you said, the real and the not real. Like, am I looking at, and even Artschwager is just so obsessed, and maybe you can tell us why with laminates. I mean, it was the time too, and it was sort of funky.
Well, he felt it was, as he always is quoted, he thought it was the ugliest material in the world, and he was determined to make these objects that actually turned out to be quite beautiful, most of them, out of this ugly, ugly thing that everybody was reviled by. I mean, we all know Formica, right? It's like,
But why is that, Bob? Because he did the same thing with the Celotex, right? The painting, there's one downstairs, this sort of grisaille painting that's on this nubby, kind of gross material that would be used
I have
for
to
ceiling.
say, one of the reasons that I think is that he really liked pushing against people. I mean, he had parameters himself, but he really liked pushing against people whose parameters I think he felt were very strict. And I think he felt that after a while you would just, I won't mention the names of artists that were at Castelli at the same time as him, but I think you'll get the idea that he felt that by, making just something that had to stick to a certain regimen, it was not interesting for him. He was all over the place.
There's also a funny way, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but there's a funny way in which maybe this is clearer in retrospect because the avant-gardism of the work is less shocking to us. But a lot of the work that's made alongside his at Castelli or in his generation seems kind of tasteful. It's very kind of
very tasteful,
yeah.
And even
What are you
today,
thinking of?
Flavin, Judd,
yeah, and even
Andre,
today, all that
yeah.
work has, even in the market, has such a strong sort of market because it's considered almost like religiously the way minimal art had to be. And Richard he just never had that mentality. He loved their work and they were all friends, but he wasn't going to make the same Formica box over and over and over again, and by lengthening it or shortening it and putting it on the wall with a lot of space around it, say that was his career. It worked for other people, and he did admire the work, and he owned some of it, but for him, he was just so curious about everything. And people always say, oh, he had such a great sense of humor, but he also tackled, as you know, very serious subjects throughout his career, especially in painting, so I just think that his playful brilliance, he really was a brilliant, brilliant man. You couldn't almost understand what he was saying to you when you would speak to him. I mean, he was just really smart, but really a lovely guy. And I think he was all over. He just wanted to touch and, play around with everything. And I think that, like after a while, the Formica, I mean, he still made things with Formica, but mostly frames towards the end of his life. And then he tackled other materials like horsehair. I mean, who was making art with horsehair in the 70s? Only he was. I mean, and it's really, some of it is just beautiful. And then he was such a great artist. He really could draw like Michelangelo. He could do everything from that to his Formica pieces. I mean, he was very, very facile in what he could do. And even with those pieces that were made with horsehair, then he would paint over them. And they were just beautiful. I mean, if he wanted to render a person on horsehair, he would render a person on horsehair. And some of these works are incredible.
Bob,
yeah.
can I ask you a kind of specific question, just because both Robert and Zoe have mentioned it, which is the use of space. And you were talking earlier about the blips, which are kind of like punctuation for architecture in some way. This idea of articulating space is very important. And so, for example, you were talking about the height that something might be hung at, or the way also that certain pieces downstairs seem to capture space or hold it, like the early double color study or that incredible corner piece, which is so perspectival. And it seems to me that a lot of the restlessness that you're describing in Artschwager is expressed spatially. And I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yes, because even some of the large works that are in, like, the Art Institute, they have a great piece there, that are really very large. There's a way that once they're placed on the wall or in the room, they absolutely become not only the focal point, but they take over the whole sort of space, which was really part of his aim, I believe, from the very beginning. And again, a lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that he started out making furniture. So he had to design those desks and couches and chairs and things for workbench. And I think the idea of making something for someone's space, I believe then he kind of jumped to the next thing as an artist, like making space somehow fluid for him, and that he could express what he wanted within the space, and he could transform the space. Because I think he got tired himself of just the idea that you put a painting on the wall, or you put a sculpture on the wall and then you look at it and that's it. He wanted to animate everything.
Yeah.
You see that. I mean, he obviously
Yeah.
thought of design and art as a cultural activity,
Yeah.
which I think connects to your work too. I mean, through your studies and what you're thinking about. And
I think what you were saying before was really clicked something for me very interesting. The questioning aspect. I tend to separate in my work the questioning works, and like the good design works, or where I try to do good design. But you were just saying that, for example, the bistro chair. Probably many of you don't know that I designed or redesigned the bistro chair, classical French bistro chair. For me, this I put it in a category that I call exercise. For me, it's like I try to do a good chair, you know, and actually don't. I always thought I'm not questioning this kind of works, especially this chair. But you said, and I think you're right. It's also a way of questioning an archetype. It's questioning. I've never seen it that way actually. For me, as I said, I was always separating the works that I would do for, when I'm totally free for an exhibition or for whatever context, but not with a client, not with an industrial commission or something like that.
Yeah, but maybe those works are just a more stealthy version of what you're doing otherwise.
Stealthy? What is
Stealthy, like sneaking under the radar and getting into people's. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
but they're always some of the hardest ones, though, because something like the bistro chair is, you're not only forced to make something that's comfortable, but you are forced to interrogate a very long history of something that we all know. So if you muck that up, we're all going to know that you
I think it's
kind of ruined the history. But it elicits so many memories. Like I've seen you on Instagram sitting on, like, you find them, and then you write, and it's so fun. I'm sure, like when you go to a cafe and you're like, oh my God, they've got my chair, and then you sit down and like.
When you find an object, you design randomly.
But it does, when I'm looking at those images of you, it's eliciting all kinds of memories, but you're creating something in our time, which I think is so interesting, like with the materials of our time, and it's a completely, in that way, new version of obviously an archetype. But I wonder with Artschwager, when I'm now thinking to the show downstairs and the Formica, which is such a high-low, like playing with such a high-low concept in which design and art, can do in different ways. But then you're working in marble, which has so many other connotations, in that regard.
I do work in marble, but in one piece of the marble in its exquisite manufacturing is paired with the cheapest or the easiest digital
the way we don't normally see
printing, which is the lampshade, and for me, that's what makes the piece. But this is one piece. Those are other pieces where I work with marble, but they're also paired with aluminum honeycomb, and there are other works that are actually where I use all kinds of materials.
Yeah, and that kind of just finding the similarities between obviously you playing with, the real and the not real, or.
Well, I did want to ask everybody about that because it's another very important theme downstairs. This question of the authentic and the fake, and some kind of weird dance with one another. And that wall piece, the light, is a great example of that. Robert, could you start with that? I mean, that piece in particular, you're using digital print of marble alongside actual stone. Exactly. And they're mimicking one another.
Like a rubber inlay paired with the marble inlay, because like rubber resin inlay.
To imitate the wire.
To make like an image of the wire that actually then sticks out as a real wire.
So you have this very kind of convoluted play of surface and substance there, which again runs through the whole show. Mm-hmm. So what's going on there? Why the interest in the inauthentic in relationship to these actual material experiences? What attracts you to that theme?
I think I'm attracted also in these kind of contrasts that, for example, with this body of work, which is called cut paste, we found this technique. This particular one has actually a lot of like massive marble, but full marble, but several other of these pieces have this. We found this technique where we could cut the marble so thin by gluing it onto aluminum honeycomb. And I was interested in the marble being so thin that it becomes almost like the image of marble. It's not like the luxurious marble anymore. So those panels would be paired with the real marble or with the massive marble.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is or where this interest comes from, but I always enjoyed this kind of I actually wrote text when I was 14. It was called Incompatibility. So has an old story. I was always interested in things that were apparently incompatible, but I would never see a reason why they really are.
Which is that high-low thing again, too, I suppose. But
and also in the other piece, which is the console.
I was just going to ask you, could you explain that? This is the green console with the kind of shape on it, mounted on its front, which is not what it appears.
Which is probably even a better example of what we were talking before, because there is this the console, which in a way represents for me the old world, because it's made of real wood, it's in perfect proportions, it's the, how do you say in English, the golden cut?
Golden ratio.
Golden ratio. Yeah. And then there's this thing, the piece is called Return of the Thing. There's this thing sitting on it, which is like a whatever shape, like a doodle, or and which tells us that today, like it's this everything goes times that we live in, and technically speaking, today is actually you can imagine a shape, and then you would find the technical possibility to make it. You don't have to do it anymore the other way around, because possibilities are so endless today.
Yeah, as in the most recent Marvel film, that kind of
exactly,
thing.
Yeah. And technically speaking, this is made with a technique called hydrographic printing. So basically you have a pool of water, you put a film on the water. The film is very, very thin, like much thinner than a piece of paper. A film with a pattern of whatever you want, wood veins in that case. And then you would dip a three-dimensional object into it, and by adherence, the film would stick to the object. So that's how we made this, like, let's say, this nice piece in this beautiful context, sitting next to the marble object. But it's actually exactly the same technique they used to do fake carbon fiber covers for iPhones. So yeah, I guess there is a link in interest here. I enjoy these two together, and so I see this thing, as I call it. It just somehow like it landed on the other piece. Yeah.
I love the title "Return of the Thing" because obviously it's the movie, but it's also sort of weirdly speaks to the Artschwagers. It's like, oh, here they are again, and they're back. Bob, can you say a little bit about? I don't know if Artschwager was prone to talking to you about this. But this idea of the inauthentic and the simulated, he's often using formicas that are, a fake wood grain, for example. And now we think of fakeness as quite an important politicized process. But I wonder how
a very
he was thinking
complicated
about
thing with him, because one of the things that Richard always talked about was that he would say, well, really I'm working with photography, and he'd really pull one on people, and they would say photography, and he would say, yes, formica is a photograph of wood grain that's transferred onto plastic. And so, he was very impish in that way. He really liked the fact that it was just such an ugly material, and yet pieces like that piece on the wall near your table, that is just such a beautiful object, that corner object, and the whole thing is made out of formica. I mean, he really knew how to work with it after a while. When you look at that little double color study that's very early, and really does look like, a diner somewhere in the Midwest, versus later on the work becomes very, very sophisticated as far as, using different colors and different shapes within, the forms have like a certain kind of formica, and he really began to use it more and more in sculpture that became really far out. As a matter of fact, I think I mentioned to you both, there's that one chair that's downstairs, and I think I told you guys a story with that, and that is that...
The one that leans slightly forward?
What it is in his driveway, the paving stones in his driveway, that shape would lie down, and then it would sort of interlock. And one day when he pulled his car in, one of the pieces came up, and he held it in his hand, and he said, a chair, and then he made that chair. But really what it is something... It's like, from the garden that was on his driveway used to pave it. So he was always looking at things, and, people always say, the thing about him too, there's just so many cliches that are like attached to him now, like was he a pop artist? Was he a minimal artist? He really was kind of a conceptual artist. And his interests were so great that, like I said, he was all over the place, and sometimes his thing, the things that he embarked on were not, an exhibition would be a failure. And then sometimes just the shock of how great he was. For example, when he won the Carnegie Medal, the whole exhibition was crates. And again, if somebody did that today, you would say, oh yeah, what's the big deal? And again, he never did things for them to be a big deal, but what I mean is that whole room that he had at the Carnegie were these crates that were shaped like, one was shaped like an upright piano, one was shaped like they just, so you would look at these crates and then in your mind you would imagine what was inside of them. And again, that was done like 35 years ago. And he just would move from thing to thing. But the Formica and as you know, and the Celotex paintings are really what he's, most known for, I would say.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Robert. Well, I was going to say there's an interesting thing there about abstraction as well, because it's quite a feat to make a crate into an abstraction, or to make, something that also operates, as you were saying earlier, as a still life, also abstract, and it makes you think that abstraction is maybe not what we thought it was. It's not just
true, and also he also wasn't like playing some kind of little riddle. So if one or two of the crates had the look of an object, he wasn't playing like this little game where that was going to look like this. But then what happens to the mind and the eye is once you see the one crate, you say, oh yeah, that must be a stand-up player piano or something. Then crates that were just absolutely, either square or rectangular, then you also would then begin to imagine. In other words, he didn't have to make like, this is the shape of a crib and this is the shape of but the one or two that did resemble something that you would see in life, then helped you to look at this crazy show of these crates and then see all this other stuff within the crates that you couldn't see. I mean,
Zoe, I guess it sort of makes you think about the associativeness of design as well.
A bit of design, but I quite like the photography analogy. Because you're going in and out of focus, aren't you, in his work all the time? Because you're like, absolutely. We've almost got to be squinting to figure out, is this really that boring? It's that interior with a couple of pieces of furniture. I mean, but it seems so interesting. Like, to me, it's just, I think it's the perception thing, I think, is really important.
absolutely. And then, for example, there are even, except that one painting, the works we have paired with you, of course, are sculpture because you're a sculptor. But, even years ago, he made this painting of a high-rise building in very sharp, perspective on fire. And many people, when they saw it many years later, thought that he had done a painting about the World Trade Center. But that painting he made was 20 years before. And many of the things that he painted came from the upper or bottom fold of the New York Times. He would read the New York Times every day his entire life. And so a lot of the things that he did, like for example, someone said to me, like, well, what? He did that painting of the bell tower in Venice collapsed. And I said, yes, because when he was reading the New York Times that day, they had something about, 100 years ago, and they had a photograph of the whole thing crumbled. So of course he set out that day and he did a painting of the bell tower collapsed. And so whatever struck him, he's done paintings all about the Afghani situation, the royalty that ruled at one point, and then the people who took over as like political cronies. And he did this whole series of paintings when he was older. And of course, what I find so interesting, nobody was interested in those paintings. I would show them and people would say like, yeah, well, what is that? I'm not interested in Afghanistan, they would say. But he was, and he was just interested in so many things. And I like what you were saying, with the objects, they really are these abstract things, but yet they absolutely bring you around to the domestic and the situational and the installation kind of thing.
Yeah. I do want to take a couple of questions from the audience if people have them, but Zoe, can I just ask you one last question, then I want to ask these gents about the bowling balls before we finish up. So Zoe, just wanted to ask you, we're here at Carpenters workshop, and this is like one of the great citadels of contemporary design. And obviously there's lots of different practices represented in the gallery that you'll see here. But I wonder what you are most excited about in the contemporary design space now, and how this idea of conceptualism might fit into it or not. Like, is that what you're paying attention to now that you're in an art institution thinking about these relationships? Is it really about the ideas? Is it about material and process? Where are your own commitments at the moment?
At the moment, my biggest commitment is to learning. I mean, obviously, I always want to be learning, but especially when you take over a new job and you're in a different place. I think for me with ICA and like thinking about, the art, the architecture, the design, I mean, obviously coming from an architecture and design background, but also I was in an art museum at the Art Institute of Chicago. So I was always thinking about how our department, how our collections fitted within that larger framework. It was constant, it's not like I ever lost that. And I think the one wonderful thing about being in a universal museum like that is we could borrow from everybody. So we were borrowing Le Corbusier tapestries from modern and contemporary. Because architecture and design lived everywhere, to be frank. I mean, it was in photography, it was in sculpture, it was in textiles. And they were objects that were about the here and now, the daily life of people. But again, I was always looking for objects that really were asking very pertinent questions, getting us to kind of interrogate why something looks a certain way. I mean, very simple questions, but can have very nuanced and layered answers.
So it's sort of about the here and now-ness at the end of the day? Is that the value that...
I think when the ICA, absolutely. I mean, ICA has been known for since '63 of doing shows with under-recognized artists. First Andy Warhol show, Robert Mapplethorpe, bringing Agnes Barton back from obscurity. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, Artschwager, like in many, many shows. So I think it's not about being topical or like what's the... just sort of for trend. It's really about, what are the projects telling us about the time in which we live? And I think that's what's so interesting about your work next to Artschwager's, because you're using the materials and the types of questions you're asking are about how we live now, or how we could live now, to get us to imagine different things, but also to question, how we navigate space, how we think about space. I think for me, when I think about, we have a show with a smell artist and researcher, Cecil Tolas, right now, who you might know just did the smells for the Balenciaga runway shows. So it's become, more well-known in the last couple of weeks, and through our show, of course. But it's, for me, she's also a designer. I mean, she's using the tools of design to kind of interrogate issues. So whether the project's about vanilla and the vanilla kind of consumer market, or whether there's a project she did a project all about the smell of money. I mean, for me, it's sort of, and what is value, and, these are projects that are in the exhibition. For me, like, those are the questions. I still think at the ICA, we've always been very issue-driven. It's really about the issues, and it doesn't, for me, I will be very liberal with what kinds of disciplines we pull in. And also pulling in, I think, the thing which was fascinating to learn throughout the history of ICA is that they've always been multidisciplinary and had shows all kinds of practitioners. And when you bring them together, like this show does, it opens up, even more channels of like communication and questioning. So I think, but it definitely learning, for me, I started the same when I was at the Art Institute. Like, how am I going to build the first collection of design, like contemporary design for this museum? Well, you go back to sort of the foundings and the history and sort of the larger, the larger scope of the museum to try and understand, okay, where do I start? Otherwise, it's completely overwhelming too. And the same at the ICA, of course, I've kind of looked back to now, and so now we chart the new place. And I think the other thing that's interesting about ICA, which we're a part of a university. We're at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the world's great research institutions. So I'm interested in practitioners who are research focused or use that as part of their practice. Of course, I was interested in that when I was at the Art Institute, but who might make furniture, who might make objects, who might paint, who might sing a song or make a film, or it's less that I'm actually just interested in what are the lines of inquiry. Like how are they helping us navigate what is a extremely challenging and complex time?
Yeah. Well, let's finish by bringing this back into focus with the bowling balls, which weirdly actually speak to a lot of the things you were just talking about, Zoe. And maybe the first thing to say is that the Artschwager bowling balls are, 60 years old almost. And now you've made this new series of bowling balls that are actually called Richard, that are a response. So can you walk us through that project first? And then I want to ask Bob about his particular relationship to bowling balls, which I know is a special one. But can you say a little bit about the inception of that response.
Yeah, so those bowling balls are actually the only work in the show that directly relate to Artschwager for me, or like intentionally relate to Artschwager as a tribute to this fantastic work, the Yes-No ball, which he did in 64, I think, 65?
68 to 77.
68 to 77.
And I'll explain that, yeah.
So you see this ball downstairs. It's a black bowling ball without the finger holes, saying yes on one side, no on the other. And then he would show this piece scattered in the gallery space, and they would randomly show yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. So I always loved this work. And my take on these bowling balls is that I use today's bowling balls, which are anything but black, but they are actually a perfect mirror on pop culture today, because you find beautiful ones, you find color splashes, you find elegant ones in one color, you find the map of the world, you find the American flag, it's everything. And then what I did is I took 12 of them, because this initially was an edition of 12, but I took 12 different ones from today, and I progressively blackened out the decor or the image. So it's like a moon phase. It starts with a small dot of black. It goes way to number 6 of the 12, which is a perfectly white bowling ball, which is perfectly white, half black, and then it goes on and on. So that's the bowling balls. And then, but maybe I should say that you see one in the gallery downstairs, but the 11 others are actually sitting in a show that I also have right now in the same time that runs until December at the Glass House in New Canaan, Philip Johnson Glass House. And so we placed those bowling balls in the sculpture gallery on the staircase.
Yeah.
And actually, I did that in a way intuitively, because it was actually, it's not easy to do a work. Plus, as a designer, placing something next to mega Frank Stellers and Heitzer, and so what can you do? I mean, I won't place my bistro chair there.
I would.
You would, okay.
It was very deft, though. It's another act of punctuation, really.
Exactly. So those bowling balls are exactly like punctuations of the space, and what the chief curator, Hilary Lewis, told me was that Philip Johnson talked about the concept of safe danger. He liked to quote this idea of safe danger in his architecture. And for example, in this space there are these big staircases and there are no handrails. So he enjoyed to tickle the user in architecture, not to feel totally at ease. So like those bowling balls that didn't make her, the curator, feel totally at ease, because she was like, oh my God, what if they roll against one of those sculptures?
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, it really reminds me of what you were saying, Zoe, about the here and nowness of different moments, because what I always think is that Artschwager was doing these yes-no balls in a field like the binary code of computing almost at that time, and your bowling balls in response feel like kind of maybe balls, you know, this kind of shifting, and make me think of the fluidity of our, you know, transitional time. But before we open up to the audience, Bob, can you say a little bit about your relationship to that body of work? Because it's kind of special, as I understand.
Well, when I was newly out of college and I worked for Leo Castelli, Richard had already made many of those bowling balls starting in 1968. And I would say about 1975, Leo asked me to take a taxi down to Blatt Bowling Ball, which was down here on Broadway near Grace Church. And I guess enough years had passed where there were new people in the bowling ball store. And so when I went in, and I had instructions from what I wanted, and they said, well, you know, what kind of holes do you want? And I said, no holes, just the bowling ball. And they said, well, but it's a bowling ball. And I said, yes, I know. And they said, well, what do you want? Do you want anything done to it? And I said, yes, I want it to say yes here and no on the other side. And they completely thought I was out of my mind. But yeah, I was the one at the end, I guess maybe edition 11 and 12, I went down and had them make it for us.
You orchestrated the fabrication.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very unusual art fabricator, but you never know what you're going to get into with Artschwager. Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you. I think we have time for just a couple of questions, if people have any. How could you not, after all that? Any thoughts, questions? Yes?
I'd like to know what is the seal or DNA that Robert had doing his artwork.
Oh, how did you start being an artist? What was the DNA?
The DNA that you put in artwork, in your artwork, something
Oh.
inspire yourself?
Yeah, well, I consider myself as a designer. I always thought it's more interesting to work from the designer, the position of the designer, and open up instead of, trying to be an artist. So, but what is the DNA? It's a difficult question. For sure, this questioning aspect that you were saying is something that I'm definitely interested in. I also curated an exhibition. I started to curate exhibitions, but not like as a professional curator, of course, or academic curator, but so I did this exhibition called Quiz. So the quizzing aspect was the focus of that project, and it was an exhibition about the unrecognizable in a way. So that also connects to what you said before. It was about things that were placed in the exhibition space, and the viewer had to figure out what it is, what can I do with this, accessorily, is this art or design, is there a function or not, etc. So yeah, I guess that's something that I'm definitely interested in. But as I said before, I'm also interested in to do objects that work as what they are just supposed to be, like a good chair. So I guess I stopped trying to choose at one point, and I'm just trying to do whatever context or moment of the day brings.
Well, DNA is made of multiple strands, right? So
Exactly.
there you go. Yeah.
Maybe I should see a doctor. I don't know.
Any other questions before we come to an end? Going once, going twice? Sure. Okay. Well, thanks all very much for coming and listening. The show will be on for a little while yet. As Robert said, he has the amazing show at the Glass House, and you really must get up to see it. I was able to see it on Friday, and it's really not to be missed, particularly if you've never seen the Glass House, which I hadn't. But even if you have, to see the way that Robert's occupied those spaces is absolutely beguiling and fascinating, so please get up there. Thank you to Zoe and Bob, and thank you to our media team, guys, as always. Thank you so much for your help. And of course, thank you to Carpenters Workshop for hosting us tonight, and to you for coming. Have a great night. Thanks.